The first thing Sarah Miller forgot was the number 4. She had been counting her steps because counting was still something a human being did. 1, 2, 3. The cracked leather of her boots struck the white crust. 5, 6. She stopped, swayed, and stared at the powder lifting around her ankles. 4 had vanished, not skipped, vanished. She tried again and lost 7. Then she forgot why she was counting at all. The salt basin spread in every direction, flat and glaring beneath the Arizona sun. Heat trembled above it so fiercely that the distant red cliffs seemed to float. The air smelled of alkali, old stone, and the scorched wool of Sarah's gray shawl. Each breath scraped her throat. When she swallowed, there was nothing to swallow. Samuel and Elias had not cried since morning. That frightened her more than the heat. The twins were tied against her chest beneath the shawl, one on each side, their bodies frighteningly light. Samuel's cheek rested under her collarbone. Elias's head lolled against her shoulder whenever she stumbled. Their lips had gone pale and dry. Once in a while, Sarah felt a thin breath against her skin, so faint that she stopped walking to make sure she had not imagined it. She had no water left. 3 days earlier, the wagon had broken an axle near the edge of the basin. 2 days before that, fever had taken her husband. Thomas had died at sundown, with one hand wrapped around a brass compass that had never pointed them toward anything useful. Even sick, he had apologized for the journey. He had apologized for the land claim that turned out to be farther west than promised, for the money lost to a broker in Prescott, for trusting a map drawn by a man who had probably never seen the country he sold. Sarah had not told him she forgave him. She had been angry, exhausted, afraid. Then his fever climbed, his breathing changed, and by midnight there was no one left to forgive. The wagon train buried him beneath a cairn because the earth was too hard to dig. By morning they were moving again. Sarah lasted with them for another day. When the wagon axle failed, the leader of the train gave her one small keg of water, 2 handfuls of meal, and an apology he could barely meet her eyes to deliver. There were sick children farther ahead. The cattle were failing. If the whole train stopped in the basin, he said, more people would die. He did not say what both of them understood. Sarah and her twins were now a problem measured against the remaining water. A woman named Martha Higgins stayed behind with her for one night. Martha shared half a cup from her own canteen and told Sarah they would walk at dawn. By noon the next day, Martha sat down in the shadow of a split boulder and said she needed only a minute. Sarah waited until the sun moved the shadow away from her. Martha never stood again. After that, Sarah walked because stopping was a kind of decision, and she refused to make it. Now, near what she guessed was midday, her left knee folded without warning. She struck the salt on both hands. The crystals burned into torn skin. Samuel made a soft clicking sound inside the shawl. "I'm here," Sarah whispered. No voice came out, only air. She pushed herself upright. The red cliffs ahead looked no closer. She remembered green hills in Massachusetts, damp laundry snapping behind her mother's house, the smell of boiled apples and wood smoke. Thomas at 23, smiling over a table covered in land advertisements, talking about wheat, a well, and a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. She remembered laughing at him because he had never built so much as a chicken coop. Then she saw him walking toward her across the salt. For one glorious second, she believed it. Thomas came through the glare in the same pale shirt he had worn on their wedding day. His sleeves were rolled. His hair moved in wind Sarah could not feel. He lifted one hand. She reached for him. The shape broke apart into light. Sarah stood alone. Something inside her, something she had been holding rigid for days, gave way. She sank to her knees and curled over the twins. The salt burned through her skirt. She pulled the shawl over the boys' heads and tucked the edges beneath their shoulders, making a poor little tent of wool and bone. "Please," she breathed. She did not know whether she was speaking to God, Thomas, the boys, or the land. Her heartbeat sounded far away. The sky went white. Then there was shade. Sarah thought at first it was another hallucination. A dark shape crossed the inside of her closed eyelids. She felt the heat lessen over her face. Something touched Samuel's throat. Her eyes opened. A man knelt beside her. He was tall, even crouched, broad through the shoulders, his skin darkened by sun and weather. Long black hair was tied at the nape with a strip of leather. A faded buckskin shirt hung open at the throat. There was a bow across his back, a knife at his belt, and a narrow scar running from below his ear toward his jaw. Sarah knew at once he was Apache. Every warning she had heard in every settlement between New Mexico and the basin rose inside her at the same time. She tried to drag the twins closer. Her arms barely moved. The man ignored her struggle. He placed 2 fingers beneath Samuel's jaw and waited. Then he checked Elias. He looked into each child's mouth, pressed lightly at the skin above their collarbones, then set his palm against Samuel's chest. His hands were scarred and large enough to frighten her. His touch was not. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had done this before. When he finally looked at Sarah, his eyes were dark and steady. No pity, no threat, assessment. She tried to say Thomas's name. Her tongue stuck against her teeth. The man reached for the shawl. Sarah's fingers tightened around it. He stopped. For several seconds, neither moved. Then he pointed at the twins, touched his own chest, and drew 2 fingers toward the red cliffs. Sarah understood only part of it. He meant to move them. She had no strength to stop him. He eased the shawl from around her shoulders and examined the weave. Then, to her shock, he tore it. The sound of wool ripping seemed unnaturally loud on the flats. Sarah made a broken noise of protest. The shawl had belonged to her mother. It was one of the last things she had carried from home. The man did not look up. He tore 2 long strips, doubled them, and twisted the fabric into broad bands. He tested each band against his forearm, then slid one beneath Samuel's back. The boy stirred weakly. The stranger lifted him to his bare chest and tied him high beneath his left shoulder. He did the same with Elias on the right, wrapping the wool across his back, so the babies rested against his warmth, their faces shaded under his jaw. Sarah watched with the stunned helplessness of a person seeing her life removed from her arms, yet the babies did not cry. Samuel's hand, which had hung open for hours, slowly curled against the man's skin. The stranger placed one hand on Sarah's shoulder and pointed again toward the cliffs. Then he turned, crouched, and pulled her arms over his shoulders. She understood too late. No. The word was a dry scrape. He slid one arm behind her knees, rose halfway, stopped to settle the twins, then stood. Pain crossed his face for the first time. Sarah weighed perhaps 110 pounds after the journey. It was not much for a healthy woman. It was enormous dead weight under a desert sun, especially with 2 infants strapped to a man's chest. He stood still until his balance settled. Then he walked. At first Sarah remained rigid, expecting him to drop her, expecting men to appear, expecting some price to reveal itself. None did. His breathing stayed slow. He looked no farther than a few yards ahead, choosing firmer seams in the salt instead of staring toward the deceptive horizon. When the crust thinned, he changed direction. When clusters of tiny dark flies hovered over hairline cracks, he followed them. Sarah had no idea what the insects meant. He did. An hour passed, perhaps 2. The sun moved west. The man's shirt darkened at the back. Sweat gathered along his neck. Once, when he shifted Sarah higher, she smelled cedar smoke in the buckskin and something bitter like crushed sage. Her thirst became madness. At one point, her face rested near his wrist. A line of sweat ran over the back of his hand. Sarah turned her mouth toward it before she knew what she was doing. Her cracked lips touched his skin. Humiliation came a moment later, weak and useless. The man did not react. He only tightened his grip beneath her knees and kept walking. The ground rose gradually. White salt became gray gravel, then broken black stone. The red cliffs grew taller until they blocked part of the sky. Sarah drifted in and out. She woke when the wind hit them hard enough to move her body. The stranger had stopped at the edge of a narrow volcanic ridge. On either side, the ground fell away into shadow. The crossing was no wider than a wagon board in places. Black glassy rock with shallow cracks for footing. Sarah understood, despite her fever, that he could not carry them across safely if she shifted. She tried to make herself smaller. The man stepped onto the ridge. The wind came again. Sarah's weight swung left. His free hand shot back and locked around her forearm. His fingers hurt. She would find bruises later. In that moment, the pain was proof she had not fallen. He waited until the gust passed, then moved forward one careful step at a time. Sarah closed her eyes. Beneath her cheek, his shoulder trembled. The man was not tireless. He was not some creature immune to heat, as settlers liked to claim when they wanted to make other men less human. He was exhausted. His body was failing by degrees, and he was choosing each step anyway. That knowledge changed something in her. She stopped thinking of him as the danger carrying her. She began to understand that he was in danger because he carried her. They crossed the ridge before sunset. On the far side, he descended into a narrow wash where the walls held shadow. He found a hollow protected from wind and finally lowered Sarah to the ground. She expected a fire. He did not make one. Instead, he dug. With his hands and a flat stone, He scooped a shallow trench in the sandy earth. The surface had cooled, but beneath it the ground still held the day's warmth. He lined the hollow with the remaining shawl and dry grass, placed the twins together in the center, then lowered Sarah beside them. Only then did he lie down. He curved his body around all three. Night came fast in the high desert. The temperature fell so suddenly Sarah began to shake. The man pulled her back against him and tucked the twins between their bodies. His forearm lay across her ribs like a heavy bar. She should have been terrified. Instead, she listened to him breathe. Slow in, slow out. The sound reminded her of the Atlantic against stone. She had not thought of the sea in years. The fever rose sometime after midnight. Sarah dreamed Thomas was standing at the end of a gray pier while waves broke beneath him. She tried to call his name, but he kept walking away. "I'm afraid," she heard herself whisper. The man behind her shifted, his arm tightened around the three of them. No promise, no prayer, no lie about morning, just pressure and warmth. Sarah slept. At dawn he was already awake. He gave her no water because, as she later learned, he had none left. He carried them again. The second day was worse. The route climbed through red sandstone gullies where the stone radiated yesterday's heat before the new sun had fully risen. The stranger's leggings tore at one knee. Blood darkened the fabric. He ignored it. When his steps became uneven, he took a piece of bitter root from a leather pouch, chewed it, and continued. Sarah's mind cleared in short, painful bursts. She began to notice details. The man favored his left leg. One of his thumbnails was split to the quick. A wide patch of old burn scar showed along his ribs when his shirt shifted. He checked the twins constantly by touch without stopping. A thumb under a jaw, a palm over a back, 2 fingers at a neck. He never checked himself. By afternoon, his breathing had changed. Each inhale came through his nose in a controlled pull. Each exhale seemed measured. Sarah realized he was rationing effort the way other men rationed water. They reached a steep chimney where there was no trail at all. He could not climb it standing. He lowered Sarah, retied her to his back with the remaining shawl, then climbed on hands and knees while the twins stayed against his chest. Every few feet he stopped with his forehead against the stone. Sarah could feel his heart through his back, too fast. Once it seemed to miss a beat. "Put me down," she managed. He did not respond. "Put me down, take them." He turned his head enough that she saw the line of his cheek. His expression hardened. Then he climbed again. Near sunset, the air changed. It happened so suddenly Sarah thought at first another fever had come over her. Coolness touched her face. The smell changed from hot mineral and dust to damp stone, green leaves, and mint. The stranger rounded a shoulder of rock, stepped through a narrow break in the canyon wall, and entered a place that should not have existed. Ferns grew beneath an overhang. Moss covered the shaded stones. Water fell in patient drops from a limestone shelf into a dark basin. Sarah heard it before she fully saw it. "Water," she began to cry. The man made it 10 more paces. Then his knees buckled. He went down carefully rather than collapsing. One hand braced on the earth to protect the children. Sarah slid from his back onto a bed of ferns. The stranger remained on his knees, breathing hard, his hands shaking too badly to untie the knots across his chest. He tried once, twice, then he bent and used his teeth. The wool came loose. He laid Samuel beside Sarah, then Elias. Both boys were breathing. Sarah touched them and sobbed without sound. The stranger crawled to the water basin. He filled a hollow gourd, returned, and lifted her head. Sarah grabbed for it. He pulled it away. Rage flashed through her. She reached again. His grip did not change. He let one mouthful wet her tongue, then removed the gourd. Sarah tried to curse him. The words came out broken. He waited, then another sip. Again he waited. Only later would Sarah understand he was preventing her from drinking too much too quickly. At the time, she hated him for every second between swallows. By the 4th small drink, her body stopped fighting. She lay back against the ferns. The stranger drank only after the twins had each taken a few drops from a wet cloth. Then he crawled to the wall, sat with his back against it, and closed his eyes. Sarah watched his chest rise, fall, rise again. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had saved them. She knew only that Thomas was dead. The wagon was gone. The train had abandoned her, and an Apache stranger had carried 3 people across country that had nearly killed him. The thought was too large for her exhausted mind. She slept with one hand resting on each child's belly. When Sarah woke again, sunlight angled gold across the cave mouth. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she heard the drip of the spring, a slow, regular sound. She touched the ground beside her. Wet moss, not salt. Samuel and Elias lay on a pallet of woven grass a few feet away. Their skin still looked too thin, but there was color in their cheeks. Their breathing was no longer the frightening flutter she remembered from the basin. The stranger sat near the entrance grinding corn between two stones. Shh, thump, shh, thump. The sound filled the shelter. Sarah pushed herself onto one elbow. Every muscle complained. The man kept grinding. Where are we? Her voice sounded borrowed. He looked at her, then at the spring. No answer. Who are you? He returned to the corn. Sarah stared at him, frustration rising through the weakness. You carried us 2 days and you won't tell me your name? The stone continued to move. She almost laughed, though nothing was funny. A person could be saved by a man and still want to throw something at him. She lay back. The next time she woke, he was feeding Elias a thin mixture of cornmeal and goat milk with a bone spoon. Sarah did not know where the milk came from until she later found a small, rangy goat tethered higher in the canyon. Elias opened his mouth weakly for another spoonful. Samuel, lying beside him, reached toward the man's hand. His fingers closed around one enormous index finger. The stranger stopped. For the first time, Sarah saw surprise on his face. It lasted only a moment. He did not pull away. Samuel held on while the man continued feeding Elias with his other hand. Something in Sarah's chest tightened. She turned her face toward the wall. That afternoon, she decided to stand. The decision arrived before the strength. She placed both palms on the ground, drew her knees under her, and pushed. For one breath, she was upright. Then her legs folded. She landed hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. The stranger looked over. Sarah waited for him to come help. He did not. Anger flooded her face. He pointed instead to a long juniper branch leaning against the wall. It lay several feet away. Sarah stared at him. He pointed again. You are a cruel man, she whispered. One corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. He turned back to the grinding stone. Sarah crawled to the branch. The bark tore at her palm. She used it to lever herself upright, legs trembling violently. She stood for perhaps 3 seconds before dropping back to her knees. The stranger never praised her. He moved the branch closer before she tried again. By evening, she could cross the width of the shelter without falling. The following morning, she learned his name. She had woken to find him checking Samuel's feet. Tiny cholla spines had worked deep into the skin during the last days of the journey. The stranger used a sharpened quill to ease them out one by one. Samuel whimpered. The man made a low sound in his chest, not a song exactly, more a steady hum. The baby quieted. When he finished one foot, Sarah pointed to him. Name. He glanced up. She touched her own chest. Sarah. Then Samuel. Sam. Then Elias Ellie. She pointed to him again. The man considered her for a long time, as if deciding whether a name was useful. Keet, he said. It was the first word she had heard from him. Sarah repeated it. Keet. He nodded once and returned to the baby's foot. That was all. But the shelter felt different afterward. A stranger could disappear. A man with a name occupied space in the world. For the next week, Sarah's life narrowed to small tasks. Drink, eat, sleep, stand, feed the boys, wash cloths at the spring, walk to the cave mouth, walk back. Keet never rushed her. He also never allowed her to become helpless. When she spilled cornmeal the first time she tried grinding, he did not take the stone from her. He moved behind her, placed his rough hand over hers, and adjusted the angle of her wrist. The stone began to make the deeper rasp she had heard from him. They worked that way until her shoulder burned. When she tried to stop early, he moved the bowl of unground corn closer. Sarah glared at him. He looked at the bowl. She finished. The labor irritated her. Then it steadied her. She began to measure time by useful things instead of grief. A bowl of meal, 2 rinsed cloths, a bundle of mint hung to dry, 3 trips with the gourd, 5 steps without the branch. Her hands hardened. Her appetite returned. The twins began to cry again, which Sarah welcomed with an absurd gratitude. Their voices meant hunger rather than death. Keet seemed to understand this. The first time both boys screamed at once. He sat by the fire repairing a sandal and did not even look annoyed. Sarah laughed. The sound startled her. It was the first time she had heard herself laugh since Thomas's fever. Keet glanced up. Sarah covered her mouth, then she laughed again. A few days later, rain came. The sky darkened before noon, purple clouds building above the canyon rim. The scent of creosote sharpened. Sarah heard thunder and froze with a wet cloth in her hands. Storms on the trail had meant broken wheels, frightened cattle, mud, fever, and men shouting in the dark. She gathered the twins and retreated toward the back of the shelter. Keet walked outside. "What are you doing?" He kept going. Rain struck the dust in heavy scattered drops. Then the sky opened. Water poured over the canyon wall. The quiet seep became a rushing sheet. The air filled with wet stone, sage, and cold mist. Keith stood at the edge of the shelter and let the rain soak him. Sarah watched in disbelief. Lightning turned the cliffs silver. Keith lifted his face. He was not challenging the storm. He was receiving it. Sarah looked down at the twins. Samuel watched the rain with his mouth open. Elias kicked both feet. The fear in her did not disappear. It changed shape. She moved closer to the entrance. The rain blew against her cheeks. Cold water ran down her neck. For the first time since the basin, water touched her, and there was more of it than she could use. Sarah cried again, but this time she laughed while she did it. Keith heard her. He looked over his shoulder. The smallest hint of warmth passed through his face. Then he turned back toward the rain. After the storm, the canyon changed by inches. Tiny yellow flowers appeared along the wash. Water gathered in pockets where there had only been dust. The goat wandered farther from the shelter and came back with green stains around its mouth. Sarah began to notice tracks she would once have stepped over without seeing. Rabbit, quail, fox, deer. Keith taught without explaining. He would stop beside a print and wait until she looked down. If she guessed wrong, he moved on. If she guessed correctly, he gave a small nod. The first time she found the seep trail by herself after filling 2 gourds, she felt more pride than she had felt on the day Thomas signed their land papers. That realization disturbed her. Thomas had not been a cruel husband. That almost made the comparison harder. He had loved her in the way a man loved a dream he believed included her. He had wanted a farm because he imagined himself becoming the sort of husband who could provide one. He wanted sons because he pictured them inheriting fields, cattle, a name. Even his love had always seemed to face toward some future horizon. Keith paid attention to whether Sarah's left ankle swelled after a long walk. He noticed if Eli swallowed badly. He set aside the softest part of cooked squash for Sam, because Sam had only 4 teeth. There were no speeches about tomorrow. There was always enough wood stacked before dark. Sarah found herself thinking about this while washing the twins' shirts in the pool. She hated the disloyalty of it. Then she hated herself for imagining that gratitude toward one living man was betrayal of a dead one. Grief, she discovered, could be petty. It wanted ownership. One evening, she took the brass compass from the pocket of her ruined dress. Thomas had carried it until his hands grew too weak. Sarah had kept it because she did not know what else to do with it. The glass was cracked. The needle still moved. She placed it on a flat rock beside the spring and watched the needle settle north. Keith came in carrying a bundle of rabbit grass. He saw the compass. Sarah tapped it with one finger. Thomas believed this could solve anything. Keith did not know all the words. She had learned that much. His English existed in fragments. Water, fire, wait, eat, no, come. He understood more than he spoke, but Sarah could never tell how much. She pointed north. It tells direction. Keith looked toward the canyon mouth. Then he looked up at the angle of the evening star. His expression did not change. Sarah laughed. Yes, I know. You don't need it. He sat beside the fire and began stripping grass fiber. After a while, Sarah closed the compass and placed it back in her pocket. She no longer expected it to show her where home was. The twins improved rapidly once their bodies decided to live. They gained weight, discovered their voices, and turned the sanctuary into a place where nothing stayed where it had been placed. Samuel crawled towards anything sharp. Elias crawled toward fire. Keith redirected both with endless patience. One afternoon, he found a fat mottled toad near the water and brought it inside on his open palm. Sarah was mending a seam in his buckskin shirt. Don't give that to them. Keith crouched in front of the boys. The toad jumped. It landed on Eli's knee. Eli shrieked. Sarah dropped the needle. Then Eli laughed. It was a round, bubbling laugh, full enough to seem impossible from a child who had once lacked the strength to cry. Samuel began laughing because his brother was laughing. The toad jumped again, and both boys slapped the ground. Keith remained serious for nearly 10 seconds. Then the skin at the corners of his eyes creased. Sarah saw it. You think this is funny. His expression flattened immediately. I saw that. He turned away to return the toad to the basin. Sarah smiled into the torn shirt in her lap. It was while mending that shirt that she found the lock of hair. The inner pocket had ripped near a seam. Sarah slid 2 fingers into the opening to flatten the cloth and felt a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. She almost put it back without looking. Then the wrapper loosened. Inside was a lock of dark hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. Sarah stopped breathing for a moment. The ribbon was cheap trade cloth. the kind sold by the yard in frontier stores. The hair had been cut cleanly and kept carefully enough that it still held a soft wave. Not a man's hair, she thought. Perhaps a woman's, perhaps a child's. The scarred skin she had seen along Keith's back came to mind. She wrapped the hair exactly as she had found it. When Keith returned near sunset, he saw the bundle beside the shirt. His whole body changed. Not dramatically, his shoulders became still. Sarah lifted the deerskin packet and placed it in his palm. I was fixing the pocket. Keith looked at the bundle, then at her. Sarah touched her chest and said, "Thomas." She pointed to the packet, but did not ask. For a long time Keith said nothing. Then he touched 2 fingers to the scar beneath his jaw and drew them down toward the burns along his ribs. "Fire," he said. Sarah nodded. He looked into the flames. "Wife." The word was barely louder than the wood settling. Sarah's throat tightened. Keith opened the packet, touched the blue ribbon, and closed it again. "Daughter," he said. There was nothing to add. Sarah did not ask how they died. She did not ask who started the fire, whether it was war, accident, revenge, or the careless cruelty of men who could leave before hearing the screams. His face told her the shape of the answer, even if it did not give the details. She moved the mended shirt closer to him. Keith took it. Their fingers touched. That night, while the twins slept between them, Sarah understood why Keith had known how to carry dying children without panic. He had once failed to carry his own out of fire, or perhaps had carried them and been too late. She never learned which. The mystery mattered less than the fact that he had chosen not to let old loss make him indifferent to new life. A few days later, Sarah woke to the scrape of a knife. Keith sat near the cave mouth carving cedar. Elias watched him as though attending church. A little horse emerged from the wood, crude in shape but smooth under Keith's thumb. When one leg splintered, Keith shaved it shorter and made the other 3 match. The knife caught on a knot. Its edge opened the pad of his thumb. Blood welled at once. Keith pressed the cut into clean clay mixed with crushed yarrow, wrapped it with a strip of hide, and resumed carving. Sarah set down the basket she was weaving. "No." Keith looked up. "No," she repeated. She crossed the shelter, took his wrist, unwound the filthy strip, washed the cut, and wrapped it with clean linen torn from the last intact hem of her old petticoat. Keith watched her work. "You would not let me drink myself sick," Sarah said. "I will not let you rot your hand off because you're too proud to wash a cut." He understood perhaps half of that. He understood enough. When she finished, he flexed his thumb. Then he handed her the tiny wooden horse. "For Eli?" Keith nodded. Sarah put it in the child's lap. Eli immediately tried to chew one ear. Keith took it back, carved the ear rounder, and returned it. Sarah laughed until tears came. Their days developed a pattern. Keith hunted at dawn. Sarah ground meal, tended the goat, washed, gathered mint, and learned to make a flat bread on hot stone. The twins slept in the shade during the hottest part of the day. In the afternoon, Sarah worked with Keith near the seep, clearing silt from narrow channels he had dug to water patches of corn and squash. The work brought back strength faster than rest had. At first she could lift only the smallest stones. By the end of the month she could carry a bucket of wet clay from the wash without stopping. Her face changed. She saw it one morning in the water basin. The sharp hollows were filling. Her hair had been cut to her shoulders because the long matted sections could not be saved. Her skin had darkened. A pale line crossed one cheek where salt and sun had burned deepest. She barely recognized the woman in the reflection. Oddly, she did not mourn the old face. She dipped both hands into the muddy edge of the pool. Mud squeezed between her fingers. On the salt flats there had been no mud because there had been no water. She rubbed the brown streak across her forearm and smiled. Dirt could be proof of abundance. The canyon began to feel less like Keith's refuge and more like a place Sarah knew how to enter. She knew which ledge stayed cool until noon, which patch of mint should not be stripped too bare, which stones turned slick after rain, which dry wash could become a flood channel with no warning. She learned to listen for the goat's bell. She learned to tell the twins apart in the dark by the way they breathed. She learned Keith's silences too. There was the ordinary silence of work. There was the alert silence when his chin lifted and his body seemed to hear farther than hers. There was the tired silence when he sat longer than usual before removing his boots. And there was the grief silence, which came some nights when the wind carried smoke from lightning-struck timber in the high country. Sarah never disturbed that one. In return, Keith learned the shape of her memories. He knew that the sound of a wagon wheel squealing from somewhere far below could make her go rigid. He knew not to touch her unexpectedly from behind. He knew Thomas's compass was not to be thrown away, even though it had no practical use to him. He knew that Sarah saved the smallest buttons from the twins' ruined clothes in a tin cup because her mother had taught her never to waste a button. They did not call this intimacy. It was simply attention repeated until it became trust. By late summer, Sam could stand while holding the cave wall. Eli preferred Keith's leg. If Keith stopped too close, Eli would grab his buckskin trousers and pull himself upright. The first time the boy took 2 independent steps, he moved from Sarah toward Keith. Sarah felt an unexpected stab of jealousy. It was instant and embarrassing. Then Keith crouched, caught Eli when he toppled, and looked at Sarah as if the achievement belonged equally to both of them. The jealousy disappeared. There was room, she realized, for a child to love more than one safe pair of hands. The thought opened a door she had kept locked since Thomas died. Sarah did not walk through it yet. Far beyond the canyon, Silas Vance found the broken wagon. He had been searching for nearly 3 weeks. He told everyone in the settlement that he was fulfilling his duty as marshal. A widow and 2 white children were missing. The territory could not simply shrug and forget them. That was true. It was not the entire truth. Silas had known Sarah before she married Thomas. He had asked her once, years earlier, to consider him instead. He had not proposed with flowers or tenderness. He had offered a house near the livery, a steady income, and the protection of his name. Sarah had thanked him and refused. Silas never forgave the calmness of that refusal. If she had mocked him, he could have hated her cleanly. Instead, she had looked at him with sympathy, as if his offer were a practical arrangement she could decline without understanding that he believed himself entitled to be chosen. Then she married Thomas, a man Silas considered weak. When news came that Thomas Miller's wagon had failed to reach the next station, Silas volunteered to lead the search. Deputy Jedediah Thorne rode with him, along with 3 local men who expected to find bodies. They found the wagon half buried in windblown salt. A torn Bible lay beneath a wheel. A cooking pot had cracked in 2. One of the twins' shoes sat under the broken axle. Jed turned it over in his hand. "No graves," he said. Silas was walking north of the wreck, studying the ground. There were tracks. Jed joined him. The marks were old but deep enough to survive the wind. A single set of moccasin prints ran toward the red country. In places the stride shortened sharply. The heels had sunk hard. Jed crouched. Man was carrying weight. Silas said nothing. Farther on, the tracks told more. Small drag marks where a woman's shoe or dress had brushed the crust. No separate infant prints. No horse. Jed stood and looked toward the cliffs. He carried them. Silas's jaw tightened. Or took them. All 3, on foot? Silas picked up the little shoe from Jed and turned it once in his hand. Keith. Jed knew the name. Most people in that part of the territory did. Keith had been called outlaw, scout, thief, Apache renegade, murderer, guide, ghost. The accusations changed depending on the speaker. What remained consistent was that he did not live under anyone's permission. "You sure? Look at the stride. He favors the left leg." Silas had tracked Keith before, never caught him. The fact sharpened the old resentment Sarah's rejection had left behind. In Silas's mind, 2 humiliations joined neatly. The woman who had once declined his protection was now somewhere beyond the law in the keeping of a man. Silas had failed to bring under it. He pressed his thumb through the brittle sole of the baby's shoe until the leather cracked. "We ride." Jed looked toward the salt flats. "We need to rest the horses. We ride before the wind takes the trail." The men followed. For the next 2 days, the tracks disturbed Jed more than any sign of violence could have. They showed no struggle. They showed endurance. At one patch of black volcanic stone, there were small rust-colored stains where someone's knees had bled. At a narrow ridge, deep scuffs marked where a man had braced under shifting weight. In a sheltered hollow, Jed found flattened sand where 4 bodies had slept close together. "He kept them warm here," Jed said. Silas did not answer. At a seep no larger than a hoofprint, they found no sign Keith had stopped to drink. Jed's respect grew despite himself. Silas's contempt grew because of it. "You're making him into a saint," Silas snapped one evening. "I'm reading the ground." "Then read it right. A pack mule carries weight too. Doesn't make it a man." Jed looked at him across the small fire. "A mule doesn't choose who to carry." Silas's eyes hardened. Jed lowered his gaze to his coffee. He did not apologize. Back in the hidden canyon, Sarah knew nothing of the riders yet. She was busy learning how much flour 4 people could lose to one careless elbow. Samuel had discovered the bowl. He overturned it while Sarah was turning flatbread on a stone. Cornmeal spread across Sarah stared in horror. Sam clapped. Eli clapped because Sam did. Keith entered carrying 2 rabbits and stopped. His gaze moved from the spilled meal to the twins. Sarah waited for anger. Food was labor. Food was time. Food was survival. Keith set down the rabbits. He picked up the wooden horse, placed it beyond the meal, and waited. Both boys crawled after it. Then he crouched and helped Sarah sweep the cleanest cornmeal from the stone floor into a separate bowl. For animals, Sarah said. Keith nodded. The dustier portion went to the goat. Nothing was entirely wasted. That night the twins ate mashed squash instead of corn porridge. Sarah lay awake afterward thinking about scarcity. On the wagon train, scarcity had made people smaller. They counted every swallow and resented every mouth. Fear turned neighbors into arithmetic. Here, scarcity produced discipline but not meanness. Keith never pretended there was enough when there was not. He simply divided what existed and worked for more. Sarah wondered whether that was why the canyon felt safer than the settlements, despite having no door. A week later, Keith took her higher into the rocks. It was the farthest she had walked since her collapse. They climbed before sunrise while the twins slept in a sling against Keith's back. Sarah carried a coil of rope and 2 gourds. The air smelled of cold stone and pine from the upper ridges. At the top of a saddle between 2 peaks, Keith stopped. Below them lay the white basin. Sarah could see the salt flats shining in the distance. Her legs stopped working. For one sickening moment she was back there, kneeling over the boys, hearing her own heartbeat slow. She turned away. Keith did not touch her. He sat on a rock and waited. Sarah pressed both hands against her thighs and breathed. The twins made small sleeping noises behind him. After a while, Sarah looked again. The basin had not changed. She had. From this distance it looked almost beautiful. She hated it for that. "Thomas is out there," she said. Keith followed her gaze. "My husband." He knew the word now. Sarah pointed toward the eastern edge of the flats. "We buried him somewhere past the wagon road. I don't know exactly where." She opened the compass in her palm. "I thought if I could get back one day, maybe." Her voice failed. Keith took a small stone from the ground and placed it in her hand beside the compass. Sarah looked at him. He pointed to the basin, then to the stone in her hand, then to her chest. She understood slowly. The grave did not need her body beside it for Thomas to remain part of her. Sarah closed her fingers around the stone. "You are very irritating when you're right." Keith looked out over the flats. The corner of his mouth moved. On the descent, Sarah found deer tracks before he pointed them out. Keith nodded. She smiled the rest of the way down. The riders found the mouth of the hidden canyon 3 days later. Keith smelled them first. Horse sweat carried on a dry updraft. Then came the faint clink of tack. He was on the upper rim checking snares when he saw the dust plume. 5 riders. One at the front wore a dark coat despite the heat. Keith watched until he saw sunlight flash from the long gun across the man's saddle. Then he went down fast. Sarah was sitting by the seat mending one of Sam's shirts. She looked up at the change in Keith before he reached her. His movements had become sharp and compressed. He gathered dried meat, cornmeal, and gourds without explanation. He pulled rawhide strips from the wall. "What is it?" Keith raised one hand. Silence. Sarah's skin prickled. He crossed the shelter and pressed his thumb against her lower lip, a gesture so direct that the old fear of being controlled flashed through her body. Then she saw his eyes. Not control, warning. She covered his hand with hers and nodded. Keith released her. He pointed upward. Sarah understood. They had practiced the route to a higher fissure only once. Within minutes, the twins were tied into a carry sling. Sarah packed the tattered shawl, Thomas's compass, the tin cup of buttons, meal, and one spare cloth. Keith led them up a path invisible from below. The fissure was narrow and cool, lined with pine needles blown down from the high country. It had water stored in 2 sealed gourds and dried meat tucked into a crack, a refuge within the refuge. Keith placed the twins there. Then he turned to leave. Sarah caught his vest. "No." He looked at her hand. "Stay." Keith shook his head. Sarah knew why. If he remained hidden with them and the riders searched carefully, all 4 could be trapped. If he moved outside, they would follow him. He intended to become the thing they saw, the target. Sarah hated the logic because it was good. "Don't die for us," she whispered. Keith's face changed very slightly. He touched 2 fingers to the twins, then to Sarah, then to his own chest. All of them, a unit. He stepped out of the fissure and disappeared down the rock. Sarah crawled to the edge. The dust plume had become men. At their head rode Silas Vance. She knew him before she could see his face clearly. The straight posture, the dark coat, the Winchester laid across the saddle. For years, Sarah had imagined that if danger ever found her, a badge might mean safety. Now the sight of Silas's badge made her stomach turn. She looked at the twins. They had grown used to Keith's quiet. Even Sam's babbling lowered when adults became still. Below, hooves entered the green edge of the canyon, mint crushed beneath iron shoes. Sarah heard Silas's voice. Sarah Miller. The name echoed off the red walls. The woman he was calling felt like someone who had died on the salt. Sarah, it's Marshal Vance. We've come to take you home. Home. Sarah pressed both palms over the twins' ears. Below, Silas dismounted into a place he did not understand. The first thing that offended him was the green. After 2 days riding through country that baked leather hard enough to crack, the canyon floor held ferns, clover, mint, and a clear thread of water. To Silas, hidden abundance meant concealment, and concealment meant guilt. He spat tobacco into a patch of clover. Jed Thorne watched the brown stain spread over the leaves. One of the other men, a ranch hand named Mercer, led the horses toward shade. The animals pulled eagerly at the water. Keep them out of that pool, Silas snapped. Could be fouled. Jed looked at the clear water running over stone. By what? Silas ignored him. The canyon held signs of ordinary life everywhere. Corn hung in small braided bundles beneath the overhang. Cleaned rabbit skin stretched on a frame. Firewood had been sorted by size and kept beneath a stone shelf. A child's wooden horse sat beside a woven mat. Jed picked it up. The toy was smooth from handling. One ear had been carved rounder than the other. Silas, the marshal, was staring toward the upper rocks. What? Jed held out the horse. Does this look like a prison camp? Silas did not take it. You think a man can't carve wood and still keep a woman against her will? I think somebody sanded this until a baby couldn't get a splinter. Put it down. Jed did. Silas walked to the grinding stone. He touched the worn surface, then looked at the patches of corn. Sarah! His voice bounced through the canyon. Up in the fissure, Sarah kept her hands over the twins' ears until her arms ached. She could hear Silas creating a story from objects he had not earned the right to interpret. You don't have to hide from him, he shouted. We found the wagon. We know what happened. Sarah almost answered. Then Silas added, that Apache can't keep you here once he knows the law has come. Anger replaced fear so quickly she felt warm. She moved her hands from the twins' ears. Eli looked at her with solemn dark eyes. Sam reached for the torn edge of the shawl. No, she whispered. He can't keep me anywhere. Neither can you. Below, a stone clicked. Every rider turned. Keith stood on a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall. He was visible for only a second. Silas lifted the Winchester and fired. The shot smashed stone beside Keith's head. Sarah screamed. Keith moved. He did not draw his bow. He ran upward along a sloping shelf, deliberately crossing open ground where Silas could see him. There, Silas shouted. He began climbing after him. Mercer and another man followed. Jed hesitated. Marshal, we came for the woman. Then get the man between us and her. A second shot cracked through the canyon. Keith vanished behind a pillar and reappeared farther up. Sarah understood at once. He was pulling them away from the fissure. Silas thought he was chasing prey. Keith was steering him. The realization brought no comfort. A bullet did not care who understood the terrain. Sarah looked at the twins. She could stay and trust Keith to risk his life alone. Or she could do what he had been teaching her since the day he pointed to the juniper branch. Stand. She took the tattered shawl from the supply bundle and tied each boy around the waist, fastening the ends to a thick cedar root growing through a crack in the stone. It would not restrain them comfortably, but it would keep them from crawling toward the ledge. She put water within reach, set the wooden horse between them, and kissed both foreheads. Stay here. Samuel grabbed her hair. Sarah gently freed it from his fingers. Mama has to go be difficult. He stared at her. You learned that from me already, so don't look surprised. She took a jagged piece of obsidian from Keith's tool shelf. It was not a proper knife, but the edge could cut. Then she descended. The first section of the hidden path was nearly vertical. Weeks earlier, she could not stand without a branch. Now her hands found holds Keith had shown her. Her feet knew where the rock widened. Dust coated her palms. Her heart pounded, but her body obeyed. Another gunshot echoed. Sarah moved faster. She reached the lower ledge just as Keith crossed the canyon above Silas. The marshal climbed poorly. His boots slid on scree. Anger made him reckless. Jed followed farther back, repeatedly glancing toward the sanctuary. Sarah stepped into open sunlight. Silas, her voice broke across the canyon. Everything stopped. Silas looked down. For a moment, Sarah watched him fail to recognize her. She knew what he expected. A pale widow in a torn dress. A frightened woman running toward a badge. Instead, he saw sun-darkened skin, hair cut rough at the shoulders, a calico dress patched with buckskin, bare feet hardened by stone, and an obsidian shard in one hand. Relief flickered across his face. Then something colder replaced it. Disappointment. Sarah saw it clearly. He had needed her to be ruined in a way that made him necessary. She had survived in a way that made him irrelevant. "Sarah," he said. She descended the last slope. "Put the gun down." Silas almost laughed. "You don't understand what's happening." "I understand you fired at the man who saved my sons." Silas climbed down 2 steps, gaining level ground. "Saved?" "Sarah, look at yourself." The sentence landed more cleanly than any insult. Sarah glanced at her arms. Scarred brown, stronger than they had been in years. "I do." Silas's mouth tightened. "You've been out here too long. Long enough." Keat had stopped high above. He could have disappeared into the maze of rock. Instead, he remained where he could see her. Sarah knew he was waiting to see what she chose. Silas looked toward him. "Come down, Keat. You know the warrant on you hasn't gone stale." No answer. "We can settle that later," Silas called. "Right now, I'm taking the woman and her children." Sarah walked until she stood between Silas and the slope leading to Keat. "You are taking no one." Silas stared at her. "You're not in your right mind." "Because I disagree with you?" "Because you've been isolated with an armed Apache fugitive for weeks after nearly dying of exposure. Any judge in the territory would understand your condition." The words were calm, reasonable, almost kind. That made them uglier. Silas was building a cage out of concern. Sarah had heard men do it to women before. Decide that fear, grief, childbirth, fever, or anger made their choices untrustworthy whenever those choices became inconvenient. And what would the judge understand about the day you didn't come for us? Silas's face hardened. "We didn't know where you were. The wagon train knew. The wagon train believed you were dead. They left us alive." Jed had reached the canyon floor. He stopped behind Silas. Sarah saw the wooden horse tucked into his belt. "They left us because the water mattered more," Sarah said. "Maybe they had no good choice. Maybe they saved 20 people by leaving 3. I don't know. I know I watched their dust disappear while I held 2 babies who couldn't cry anymore." Silas glanced at the other men. He did not want this story told in front of them. That has nothing to do with him. It has everything to do with him. Sarah pointed toward Keat. "He found us on the flats. Sam barely had a pulse. Eli was worse. I couldn't stand. Keat tore my shawl into straps, tied the boys against his own chest, and carried me." Mercer looked up at the distance they had descended into the canyon. Sarah continued. "He carried all 3 of us across the salt and over the black ridge. He slept in the dirt around us because he would not light a fire and give away our position. He climbed the last mile bleeding from both knees. He reached water and gave it to my children before he drank." Silas shook his head. "You don't know what he intended. I know what he did. He took advantage of a dying woman." Sarah laughed once. It was not a pleasant sound. "He wouldn't even help me stand." Jed blinked. "What?" Sarah looked at him. "First day I tried, I fell. I waited for him to lift me. He pointed at a branch and made me get it myself." Mercer's mouth twitched. Silas shot him a look. Sarah stepped closer. "He taught me to grind corn, clean water, read weather, find the trail. He fed my children. He pulled cactus needles from their feet. He carved them toys. If that is captivity, Silas, your idea of freedom must be a very poor thing." Silas's hands tightened around the Winchester. "Those boys need a Christian home." Sarah's expression changed. "They need people who keep them alive. They need their own kind. They need kindness. You think this lasts?" Silas demanded. "Winter comes. Soldiers come. Another band comes through. Some trader sees you. You think the world will leave this little arrangement untouched?" There, finally, was something close to truth in him. Not all of his concern was invented. The frontier was dangerous. Law, prejudice, violence, hunger, and weather could all reach them eventually. But Silas took that truth and used it as ownership. "Maybe it won't last," Sarah said. "That doesn't make it yours to end." Silas's eyes went to the obsidian in her hand. "Put that down." Sarah did. She let the stone fall into the dust. Then she walked straight to him. Silas lifted the rifle instinctively, not aiming at her but bringing it across his body. Sarah placed her palm on the barrel. The metal was hot from the sun. Her skin burned. She held it anyway. "Look at my hand." Silas looked at her face. Look at it. His gaze dropped. The palm he remembered had once been pale, narrow, softened by domestic work. This hand had thickened. The base of the fingers was calloused from stone. A white scar crossed the heel from the salt basin. Dirt remained in the lines despite washing. This hand dug irrigation channels, Sarah said. It carried clay, it ground food for my boys. It held Keith's shirt together when the seams tore. It climbed down here without anyone carrying me. She pushed the barrel slowly toward the ground. Silas resisted for half a second. Then he let it lower. You came to rescue the woman you remember, Sarah said. She isn't here. Silas's face flushed. You don't know what people will say? Sarah almost smiled. At last they had reached the wound beneath all his arguments. There it is. What? You care what the town will say. I care what becomes of you. You care that I chose a life you can't explain. Silas stepped back as though she had struck him. I offered you a decent life once. Jed looked sharply at him. The other men went still. Sarah's voice softened. Yes, you did. Silas's jaw worked. And you chose Thomas. Look where that got you. The cruelty of it hung in the air, Jed whispered. Silas. Sarah felt grief rise. But it no longer owned her knees. Thomas made mistakes, she said. He also died sorry for them. You are alive and still making yours. Silas's face emptied. For a second Sarah thought he might hit her. Instead he jerked the rifle free from beneath her palm and turned it toward the upper ledge. Keith was no longer there. Silas spun. Keith stood 20 paces away in the shadow of a red pillar. No one had heard him descend. His bow remained on his back. His knife remained sheathed. He simply stood beside the path to the shelter, watching. Silas brought up the Winchester. Sarah moved in front of it again. Move. No, Sarah, no. Keith did not reach for a weapon. That unnerved the men more than if he had. Silas was breathing hard now. What's the price? He demanded. Keith stared at him. What did you take? Money? Jewelry? Thomas's claim papers? What does she owe you? Keith said nothing. Answer me. Silence. Sarah understood the cruelty of Keith's refusal better than anyone. Silas wanted an argument because an argument would put them on equal ground. He wanted anger because anger would justify his own. He wanted Keith to threaten him so the rifle could become necessary. Keith gave him none of it. He looked at Sarah instead, not over her, at her, waiting. This was her decision. Silas saw the exchange and hated it. You let him decide for you? Sarah almost laughed again. He's waiting for me to decide. That's what you still don't understand. Jed removed his hand from his revolver. The gesture was small. Silas noticed. Deputy. Jed looked at the twins' toy in his belt, then at the water channels, the corn, the patched dress, Keith's scarred hands. Marshall, she says she's here by choice. She's not competent to make the choice. She just climbed down a cliff to stop you from shooting a man. She seems fairly decided. You don't get to interpret the law. Neither do you get to invent captivity when the supposed captive says there isn't any. Mercer lowered his rifle. The two other men followed more slowly. Silas looked from one to another. His authority did not vanish dramatically. It leaked away. The canyon made ranks seem small. This is what you want? He asked Sarah. For the first time, his voice sounded tired. Sarah looked toward the upper ledge where she knew her children waited. She looked at Keith, then at the thin channel of water running through mint beneath her feet. Yes, you choose this over town? I choose my children alive. I choose work I understand. I choose the man who never once treated me like something he could own. Silas's mouth tightened. When he grows tired of you. Keith's expression did not change. Sarah's did. Then I will still know how to stand. The answer landed harder than any declaration of love could have. Silas lowered the rifle. He looked at Keith one last time. If I see you inside settlement limits, the warrant still stands. Keith gave no sign he cared. Silas turned away. His horse had trampled a patch of mint nearly flat. He stepped through it, mounted and pulled the reins sharply. Jed remained behind. You coming? Silas called. In a minute. Silas rode out with the other men. Jed stood awkwardly beside the spring. Sarah's anger cooled enough that she noticed how badly sunburned he was. He took the wooden horse from his belt and put it back where he had found it. I didn't know, he said. Sarah said nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck. That's not an excuse. He went to his saddlebag and returned with a small canvas sack and a tin coffee salt. The irony of the salt was so sharp Sarah almost smiled. Jed noticed. Bad choice? Useful choice. He set both on a flat stone. We passed your husband's cairn on the way. Sarah's face went still. You found it? Jed nodded. East of the broken wagon, we reset some of the stones. Coyotes had been at the edge, but not the grave. Sarah looked down. For weeks she had imagined Thomas erased beneath the sun. Knowing his grave still existed brought an ache so old it felt clean. "Thank you." Jed tipped his hat. Then he looked at Keat. "I don't suppose thanks means much from me." Keat picked up the canvas sack, weighed it, and handed it to Sarah. Jed gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "Fair enough." He mounted and followed the others. The sound of hoofbeats faded. Only then did Sarah realize her knees were shaking. She sat abruptly on the rock. Keat came closer. For a foolish second, she expected him to praise her. Instead, he looked at her palm. The skin was red where the rifle barrel had burned it. He took her wrist and led her to the water. "Of course," Sarah muttered. "I defend your life, and you're worried about a blister." Keat lowered her hand into the cool pool. Relief ran up her arm. She started laughing. The laughter came too fast, too hard, sliding into tears before she could stop it. Keat crouched beside her. Sarah pressed her wet palm over her eyes. "I thought he was going to kill you." Keat did not speak. And the worst part is that he thought he was right. Water dripped from her wrist. Thomas thought he was right too, about the land, about the journey, about always going farther. Maybe that's what frightens me now. Men who are certain. Keat waited. Sarah lowered her hand. "You're certain about things." He tilted his head. "You are. Don't look innocent." The corner of his mouth moved. Sarah shook her head. Then she saw movement above. Samuel had worked one arm free of the shawl binding and was waving furiously from the upper ledge. "Oh, Lord." Sarah stood. Keat was already moving. They climbed together. Eli had fallen asleep against the cedar root. Sam had nearly untied himself. Keat picked him up. Sam buried his face against Keat's chest and began to cry, the delayed reaction of a child who had been silent too long. Sarah gathered Eli and sat on the floor. For several minutes, no one tried to be brave. Sam cried, Sarah cried quietly. Eli woke and joined Sam because crying appeared to be the family activity. Keat sat against the wall with one child in his arms and one hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. The hand was heavy, warm, and absolutely still. By nightfall, they were back at the lower shelter. Sarah unwrapped Jed's coffee as if opening treasure. The smell alone filled the cave with memories of kitchen's mornings and ordinary people arguing about ordinary things. "You drink coffee?" she asked Keat. He looked suspicious. Sarah smiled. "Then tonight you learn something from me." She boiled water in the blackened pot, added grounds, and waited until the smell deepened. Keat took one sip and frowned. Sarah laughed. "It's supposed to taste terrible, that's part of it." He took another sip. The twins slept early, exhausted by the day. Sarah and Keat sat by the fire. For the first time since the riders came, the canyon felt quiet rather than watchful. Sarah took Thomas's compass from her pocket and placed it between them. Silas found his grave. Keat listened. "I thought hearing that would make me want to go back." She turned the compass in her fingers. "It doesn't." Keat looked toward the dark outside. Sarah followed his gaze. "I don't know what this is." He looked at her. "You, me, the boys, this place." Keat's face became unreadable again. Sarah almost regretted speaking. Then he reached across the space between them and took the compass. He opened it. The needle trembled and settled. Keat pointed north. Sarah nodded. Then he turned the compass in his hand, so the casing pointed in another direction while the needle kept returning north. He touched the compass. Then Sarah's chest, then the sleeping boys, then his own chest. Sarah stared. "You're saying I know where I am?" Keat considered. "Stay," he said. The word was low and careful. Sarah's throat tightened. He added after a long pause, "Together," 2 words. More than he had spoken to her at one time since naming himself. Sarah looked at the boys, at the mended clothes hanging near the fire, at the goat sleeping outside under its crude shelter, at the bowl of cornmeal she had ground that morning, at Keat's burned hands around Thomas's compass. "Together," she said. Keat nodded. No vow followed, no claim. The decision entered their life the same way everything else had, as a fact proven by what they would do the next morning. And the next morning there was work. Silas did not return. For several weeks, Sarah expected him anyway. Every distant hoofbeat made her pause. Every dust plume drew her eyes toward the canyon mouth. Keat noticed, but never mocked her vigilance. He reset a few stone markers along the approach and moved the children to the upper refuge whenever unknown riders crossed the far flats. None entered. News, when it came, arrived through Jed. He appeared alone near the end of September and stopped his horse outside the green edge without entering until Sarah waved him in. That act mattered. He had learned to ask without words. Jed brought flour, needles, 2 bars of lye soap, and a folded newspaper 3 weeks old. "I'm not here official," he said. "You look less impressive without Silas," Jed grinned. Most people do. Keat watched from the shade while repairing a bowstring. Jed kept his hands visible. Vance told town you were alive and chose to stay out here. Sarah blinked. He told the truth? A version of it. Said you'd been affected by hardship and refused assistance. There it is. But he also told folks not to organize any more search parties. Said the canyon wasn't worth losing horses over. Sarah looked toward Keat. He mentioned Keat? Jed hesitated. Said the warrant still exists. Keat continued working. Does it? Sarah asked technically. For what? Jed scratched his jaw. Depends which paper you read. Livestock theft on one, assault on another, resistance to arrest on a third. Did he do any of it? Probably some. Probably not all. Sarah disliked the answer because it sounded like the frontier. Nothing arrived clean. Jed held out the newspaper. There's also word of an early cold season. Snow hit the high country north of here. Thought you should know. Keat looked up at that. Within 2 days he began winter work. Sarah joined him. The canyon that had saved them from heat could kill them with cold if they treated shelter casually. They hauled clay from the wash, mixed it with dry grass, packed cracks in the cave wall, cut cedar poles, built a windbreak across the entrance, dug a shallow storage pit where squash and dried meat could stay cool but not freeze solid. The work left Sarah's hands split at the knuckles. She wrapped them and kept going. Keat showed her how to mix ash and animal fat into a salve. Sarah improved it with beeswax from a wild hive Jed had once mentioned near the southern ridge. By October, they had 2 sleeping pallets raised off the stone floor, a clay-lined hearth that pulled smoke upward through a natural crack, and a low enclosure for the goat. One morning, Sarah broke a skim of ice on the water bucket. She stared at it. Summer had made the canyon feel permanent. Ice reminded her permanence had to be built. She heard Keat below in the wash-fitting slabs of slate into the wall. Sarah put on Thomas's old wool socks, which she had cut and resewn to fit better, and went to help. They worked without speaking for hours. Sarah carried wet clay, Keat packed it into gaps. She cut grass fiber, he pressed stone. When he reached for a bucket, she had already moved it closer. When she needed the heavier mallet, he passed it before she asked. Their movements had learned each other. Near sunset, Sarah realized they had built an entire wall without exchanging a word. She looked at Keat. He looked back. Both smiled. That evening frost whitened the outer ledge. Inside, the fire held. Winter stripped the canyon down to essentials. The first hard freeze came at night with a wind that found every mistake they had made in the walls. Sarah woke because the fire sounded wrong. The usual soft crackle had become an occasional pop. The warmth against her face was fading. She opened her eyes. The twins were asleep beneath rabbit skins, bundled so tightly that only their noses showed. Keat was already crouched at the hearth. The chimney draft had reversed under a violent gust. Smoke pressed into the cave instead of rising. Keat pulled burning wood from the hearth 1 piece at a time and buried it in a clay pot. Sarah opened the small vent near the floor. Cold air rushed over her hands. Within minutes, the cave was nearly dark and bitterly cold. But the smoke... Then now what? She whispered. Keat pointed toward the windbreak. 1 cedar panel had loosened. They repaired it by moonlight. Sarah held the panel against the gust, while Keat drove rawhide ties through drilled holes in the rock. Her fingers went numb. Wind pushed grit into her eyes. Behind them, one of the twins began to cry. Almost, Sarah called, though she did not know whether she meant the baby, Keat, or herself. Keat tied the last knot. They returned inside, rebuilt the fire, and spent the remainder of the night awake to make sure the smoke rose properly. At dawn, Sarah looked at the blackened ceiling and laughed from sheer exhaustion. We survived the salt to be murdered by our own fireplace. Keat handed her a cup of hot water with mint. You could at least pretend that was funny. He sat down beside her. After a moment, his shoulders shook once. Sarah stared. Was that a laugh? Keat's face became still, cored. The twins woke and demanded breakfast. Winter settled around them. Days became shorter, work slower, meals heavier. Keat brought home deer when he could and rabbits when he could not. Sarah learned to render fat, smoke strips of meat, and make a coarse stew thickened with corn. She saved bones for broth. Nothing with value went into the fire. She also rediscovered skills Keat did not have. Sewing had always been ordinary to her. In the canyon, it became engineering. She altered hides into small trousers for the boys, lined Keat's worn moccasins with rabbit fur, and made mittens from the sleeves of Thomas's old wool coat. Keat watched her turn scraps into useful things with the same attention she once gave his tracking. One evening he handed her a bundle of carefully scraped hide and pointed at his shoulders. Sarah looked at the hide, then at him. "You want a shirt?" He nodded. "You are capable of asking, after all." Keat sat beside the fire while she measured him with twine. He clearly disliked being measured. "Hold still." He moved his arm. "If you want both sleeves the same length, stop behaving like Sam." Sam, sitting nearby with the wooden horse, looked up at hearing his name. Keat looked at Sam. Sarah laughed. "Yes, I compared you to a baby." The shirt took 3 nights. When Keat put it on, the shoulder fit cleanly over the burn scars and the sleeves reached his wrists. He touched the stitching. Sarah pretended not to care whether he liked it. Keat walked to his tool shelf, took down a small leather sheath, and offered it to her. Inside was a knife with a narrow iron blade and a cedar handle sized for her hand. Sarah stopped breathing. The blade had been hammered from a broken strip of wagon iron. The handle bore shallow cuts for grip. "For me?" Keat nodded. Sarah ran her thumb along the flat, not the edge. "You made this." He shrugged as if he had found it on the ground. She looked at the even hammer marks. Liar. He met her eyes. The warmth that moved through Sarah then frightened her more than the rifle had. Danger was simple. You survived it or did not. Tenderness asked what came next. Sarah slipped the knife into its sheath and fastened it at her waist. "Thank you." Keat touched 2 fingers to the seam of his new shirt. An exchange, equal enough to satisfy them both. The boys' first winter fever came in December. It was not the devastating sickness that had killed Thomas, only a cold that settled into their chests. But Sarah did not know that on the first night. Samuel coughed until he vomited. Elias grew hot and limp. The old terror returned in full. Sarah stopped being the woman who had learned the canyon and became again the mother counting shallow breaths on a salt flat. She paced with Eli against her shoulder. "He's too warm." Keat crushed willow bark and steeped it with water. Sarah wiped the baby's face. "What if it's the fever?" Keat placed his hand on Eli's chest. What if Thomas brought it to them before he died? What if it stayed? Keat caught her wrist. Sarah tried to pull away. He held firm and made her look at him. Then he pointed to Eli. Breathing, he pointed to the cup. Water, he pointed to the fire. Warmth. Then he touched the ground now. Sarah closed her eyes. Her fear had run forward into deaths that had not happened. She sat. They worked through the night. Cool cloths, small drinks, warm broth, rest. At dawn, Eli's fever broke. Samuel's cough eased by the next evening. Sarah slept 12 hours afterward. When she woke, Keat had both boys tucked beneath his arms while he repaired a snare. They looked pleased with themselves. Sarah stared at them. "I suffer all night, and you 3 form a club." Eli smiled. Keat handed her coffee. That, Sarah decided, was an apology for nothing and everything. The cold months gave them long evenings. Sarah began teaching the twins words while Keat worked. "Fire." Sam pointed. "Water." Eli slapped the cup. "Mama." Both boys pointed at Sarah. Then Sam pointed at Keat. Sarah paused. Keat looked up from his bowstring. The child made an uncertain sound. "Key." Keat went very still. Sam tried again. "Key." Sarah smiled. "Keat, key, close enough." The name stayed. By spring, both boys used it more often than any other word besides mama. Keat never asked them to. Sarah never corrected them. In January, a heavy snowfall sealed the high path for 3 days. Sarah had never seen snow settle on red rock. The canyon turned white along its upper shelves, while the deeper walls remained copper and black. The contrast made the whole place look unreal. Keat woke the boys and carried them outside wrapped in fur. Sam reached toward falling flakes and looked offended when they melted in his hand. Eli stuck out his tongue. Sarah stood beneath the overhang, with a blanket around her shoulders. The scene struck her with such force that she had to grip the cedar post. Thomas should have seen them. The thought arrived without warning. She missed him suddenly, terribly. Not the dreamer who made bad decisions, not the husband she had been angry with, but the young man who used to dance badly in their kitchen when no one watched. Grief bent her. She turned away so the boys would not see. Keat noticed. He handed Sam to her. Sarah pressed her face into the child's hair. "I miss someone," she said. Keat nodded. He understood the sentence even if he did not know every word. Sarah looked toward the white basin hidden beyond the canyon walls. "It doesn't mean I want to leave." Keat's gaze stayed on the snow. "I know," he said. 2 English words, spoken clearly. Sarah looked at him. He did not repeat them. He did not need to. When the thaw came, Sarah decided to visit Thomas's grave. She expected Keat to object. Instead, he packed food. They waited until the twins were strong enough for the journey and the weather stable. Jed had given Sarah rough directions to the cairn. Keat knew the basin better than any map. They left before dawn. This time, Sarah crossed the black ridge on her own feet. She stopped at the midpoint where wind cut across the drop. Months earlier, she had hung unconscious over Keat's shoulder there. Now Sam rode in a sling on her back. Eli rode with Keat. Sarah looked down at her hands gripping the rock. Then she crossed. The salt flats were worst at midday. Even in spring, the glare hurt. Sarah covered the twins' heads and kept her eyes on Keat's feet rather than the horizon. Memories rose from the ground with the heat. Martha sitting in the shade. Thomas reaching through fever. The wagon train disappearing. Her own body folding over the boys. Sarah kept walking. They found the wagon first. Wind had buried half of it. The broken wheel leaned where it had fallen. A spoon lay among the salt grass. Sarah picked it up and recognized the dent Thomas made years earlier when he tried to crack walnuts with it. She smiled, then cried. Keat waited with the boys. East of the wagon they found the cairn. Jed and the men had reset the stones. A weathered strip of wagon board had been wedged upright with Thomas Miller scratched into it. Sarah knelt. For several minutes she could not speak. Keat moved away with the twins, giving her privacy without abandoning her. Sarah took out the brass compass. You were wrong about the farm, she said. Wind brushed salt over the stones. You were wrong about a lot of things. Her voice shook. So was I. She set the compass on the cairn. The boys are alive. That broke her. Sarah bowed her head and wept into both hands. She told Thomas about the rescue, about the spring, about Sam walking, about Eli's fever, about the wooden horse with the rounded ear, about coffee tasting like civilization and not necessarily being an improvement. She told him she had been angry when he died. She told him she had forgiven him later, which was unfair because he could not hear it. Then she told him the hardest truth. I'm staying. The wind moved again. Not because I stopped loving you, because I'm still alive. Sarah placed a small smooth stone from the hidden canyon beside the compass. When she stood, her knees ached but held. Keat came closer. He did not ask if she was finished. Sarah took Eli from him. Let's go home. They returned to the canyon before the next sunset. Sarah never went back to the grave again. She did not need to. Spring brought work enough to crowd memory into its proper place. The seep overflowed after snowmelt. Keat and Sarah extended the irrigation channels. They planted more corn, beans, squash, and a small patch of onions grown from bulbs Jed brought. The first onion harvest made Sarah absurdly happy. She sliced one into rabbit stew and made Keat taste it. His eyes watered. Sarah grinned. Now who is weak? Keat wiped one eye with the back of his hand and kept eating. The twins learned the canyon at ground level. Sarah tied bells to the backs of their little belts because they moved too fast to watch constantly. Keat hated the bells at first. They offended every instinct he had about moving quietly. Then Elias hid behind a boulder for 20 minutes, and Keat became the one who fastened the bell most securely. By early summer, their shelter began to change into a homestead. Keat cut cedar posts from higher country. Sarah mixed mud mortar. Together they built a low wall that extended the living space beyond the original cave. They made a roof of poles, brush, and clay. Smoke escaped through a stone vent. The goat gained a second goat after Jed traded one for a cured deer hide and 2 days of Keat's tracking work. Jed had become a careful visitor. He never arrived unannounced if he could help it. At the canyon mouth, he fired one shot into the air, not as a threat but as agreed warning, and waited. The first time he brought mail, Sarah stared at the envelope for a long time. It was from her sister Abigail in Massachusetts. Jed had told someone in town Sarah was alive. That person told a trader. The news traveled east in the strange, slow chain by which frontier rumors became family facts. Sarah opened the letter with Keat's knife. Abigail wrote that their mother had died the previous winter. She wrote that the family had believed Sarah dead. She begged Sarah to come east if she was able. There was money enclosed, $15 in folded notes. Sarah read the letter twice, then a third time. Keat sat across from her repairing Eli's sandal. Sarah handed him the money. He examined the paper and gave it back. My sister wants me to go home. Keat's hand stopped, Sarah noticed. Back east, Massachusetts. He looked toward the boys, who were trying to roll stones down a plank. Then he continued working. No argument, no plea. The absence of one hurt Sarah more than a demand would have. You'd let me go. Keat looked up. Sarah. She waited. He pointed east, then to her, then opened his hand. Choice. Sarah laughed softly because of course. Of course he would not make staying a condition of belonging. She folded Abigail's letter. For 2 weeks, Sarah considered the possibility seriously. Massachusetts meant doctors, schoolhouses, family roofs that did not have to be resealed with mud, stores where salt could be bought without risking 40 miles of desert. It meant her sons might grow without warrants, rifles, or strangers deciding their household was a scandal. It also meant leaving Keith. More than that, it meant leaving the person she had become with him. Sarah imagined returning east as a widow with two half-wheeled boys who used hand signs before words and could identify coyote tracks. She imagined parlor conversations explaining where she had lived and with whom. She imagined people praising her rescue while refusing to let Keith through their front door. The thought exhausted her. One evening, she sat beside the irrigation channel while the twins splashed their feet. Keith was repairing a section of wall. Sarah held Abigail's letter in her lap. "I could take them east," she said. Keith kept working. They would have school, family. He pressed clay into a seam, maybe easier lives. Keith stopped. He looked at her. Sarah realized what she had said. Easier was not the same as better. Hard was not automatically noble either. She had spent months learning not to turn suffering into virtue just because they had survived it. "I don't want them to suffer because I am stubborn," she said. Keith sat back on his heels. He pointed to the boys. Sam was trying to dam the irrigation channel with both hands. Eli was removing the same mud as quickly as Sam placed it. Both were healthy, brown, loud, and completely absorbed in their argument. Keith pointed east, then shrugged. He did not know if east was better. Neither did Sarah. That uncertainty was honest. She folded the letter again. "I want to stay." Keith resumed the wall. Sarah frowned. "You could look a little pleased." He pressed another handful of clay into place. She threw a pebble at him. It struck his shoulder. Keith turned. Sarah raised her eyebrows. He walked over, scooped a handful of cold irrigation water, and poured it over her head. Sarah gasped. The twins screamed with delight. She tackled Keith at the knees. He did not fall. She pushed harder. He stepped backward into the channel. For 5 minutes, the family forgot dignity. Jed arrived the next morning to find everyone's clothes spread over rocks to dry. He wisely asked no questions. Sarah wrote to Abigail that day. She did not explain everything. There were truths that could not cross 2,000 miles on paper without becoming something else. She wrote that she and the boys were safe, that they had food, that she had chosen to remain in Arizona, that the man who saved them was named Keith, and that he was family. She used the word deliberately, family. When she read the letter aloud to Keith, he understood that word. He looked at the twins. "Together," he said. Sarah nodded. "Together." Summer returned. This time the heat did not surprise her. Sarah began work before sunrise and rested at noon. Water jars stayed in shade. The boys wore light cloth over their heads. Keith showed them how to touch the ground with the backs of their fingers before sitting on exposed rock. At 18 months, Sam tried to copy everything Keith did. If Keith sharpened a stick, Sam rubbed 2 stones together. If Keith checked a track, Sam crouched over goat droppings with great seriousness. Eli preferred Sarah's work until food was involved, at which point loyalty disappeared entirely. The wooden horse lost 1 leg. Keith replaced it. Then Sam demanded a horse too. Keith carved a second one. Then both boys fought over the older horse because it was apparently superior. Sarah separated them. This is why civilization invented identical toys. Keith gave her a look. "Do not blame me. You taught them scarcity." He pointed at her. "Me?" Keith nodded. Sarah stared. "You've become very bold for a man who once spoke 1 word a week." His English improved slowly because the boys forced it to. Children accepted no philosophical commitment to silence when they wanted answers. Why became Sam's favorite word. Why rock? Why bird? Why hot? Why goat? Keith tried ignoring him. Sam followed. Why? Keith eventually answered in a mixture of English words and gestures. Sarah watched the great silent man of the canyon defeated by a 2-year-old and considered it one of life's fairer outcomes. Her own knowledge changed too. She became the household reader. Jed brought old newspapers, almanacs, notices, and once a battered book of geography. Sarah read them aloud near the fire. Keith listened most closely to weather tables and livestock prices, least to politics. When Sarah read a notice offering a reward for information leading to Keith's arrest, the room went quiet. The paper described him as dangerous, armed, and suspected in a string of thefts. Sarah looked at him. "Did you steal 12 army horses?" Keith shook his head. 4? A pause. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Keith." He held up 2 fingers. Sarah stared. "You stole 2 army horses." Keith pointed toward his burned scars, then made a gesture of writing. The story emerged in fragments over several nights. Years earlier, after the fire that killed his wife and daughter, Keat had been forced from one range to another. A military patrol took his surviving horse and supplies during a roundup. Weeks later, he took 2 horses from the same post. One officer tried to stop him. Keat struck the man and escaped. Later thefts were added to his name because it was useful to have a known culprit. Sarah folded the newspaper. "So you are a horse thief." Keat looked offended. "2. A very precise horse thief." "Mine," he said. Sarah understood. He believed he had reclaimed what had been taken. Silas would not appreciate that distinction. Keat smiled faintly. Neither would a judge, Sarah thought. But she had learned that law and justice could stand near each other without always being the same thing. She saved the newspaper anyway. Not because she believed its accusation, because it was part of the record they were building, and Sarah had become protective of records. The town could write one version. Her sons would hear another. The years did not become easy. They became theirs. There were lean seasons when rabbits were scarce. A flash flood once tore half the irrigation wall away and buried young corn beneath mud. One winter the goat died giving birth, leaving them to raise the kid by hand. Keat injured his shoulder in a fall and spent 6 weeks unable to draw his bow. During those weeks, Sarah hunted rabbits with snares and traded woven mats through Jed for flour and beans. Keat hated being unable to work. Sarah pointed to a juniper branch leaning against the wall, the same one he had once made her crawl toward. "Use the tool," she told him. His glare could have cracked stone. Sarah smiled sweetly. "Strength is reclaimed through labor. Isn't that what you taught me?" Keat's English was now good enough for him to mutter something rude. Sarah laughed so hard she had to sit down. When his shoulder healed, he made her a new storage shelf without being asked. That was as close to surrender as she expected. The boys grew. At 4, Sam was restless and observant. Eli was quieter, patient enough to sit with Keat while he repaired a bow for an hour. At 5, both could follow a trail Sarah could not see. At 6, Sarah began formal lessons in reading with charcoal letters scratched on flat stone. Keat learned beside them without announcing that he was learning. Sarah noticed because one morning he pointed to the word water before either boy did. She said nothing. The next evening, she wrote Kate. He stared at the letters. Then he copied them. His first written name looked crooked and fierce. Sarah kept the stone until rain washed it clean. Jed became sheriff after Silas left the territory. The news arrived quietly. Silas had resigned 2 years after the canyon confrontation and gone north to work private security for a mining company. There was no dramatic downfall, no trial that proved Sarah right. He simply moved to a place where his authority could be purchased by different men. Sarah found that more believable than punishment. One evening she asked Jed whether Silas ever spoke of the canyon. "Once," Jed said. "What did he say?" "Said you were too stubborn to save." Sarah smiled. "Maybe he finally understood me," Jed laughed as sheriff. He quietly stopped circulating Keat's old warrant within his district. He could not erase federal paper, but he could choose what to spend men and horses pursuing. "Don't make me regret it," he told Keat. Keat gave him a long look. Jed sighed. "You could say thank you once in your life." "Coffee," Keat said. Jed blinked. "What?" Keat pointed to Jed's saddlebag. Sarah burst out laughing. Jed handed over the coffee. "You're welcome." By the boys' 8th winter, the cave had become only part of the home. A low timber room stood against the rock, insulated with clay and roofed in earth. There was a table Keat built from split cedar, 2 stools, shelves for crockery, hooks for dried herbs, and a small window covered with oiled cloth during storms. Sarah planted a peach pit near the irrigation ditch, even though Keat shook his head at the soil. It might grow. He pointed to the poor ground. It might. He pointed to the sun. It might. He pointed to the goats. They will not eat it because I will murder them. Keat raised an eyebrow. Sarah built a little stone fence around the pit. 3 years later, the tree gave them 6 small bitter peaches. Sarah ate one with tears in her eyes. Keat took a bite, made a face, and handed it back. "No appreciation for agriculture," she said. The boys ate the other 5 before sunset. There was one summer when the boys were 7 that reminded Sarah how quickly a safe place could become dangerous. The rains had failed twice. Grass on the upper slopes turned brittle by June, and the juniper smelled dry enough to burn from a spark. Keat stopped allowing the boys to carry fire from the hearth. He cleared brush in a wide ring around the timber room and stored extra water in clay jars near the door. Sarah understood the precautions. She did not understand the way his face changed whenever he looked toward the western ridge. One afternoon, lightning struck beyond the canyon. No rain followed. By dusk, a brown cloud lay against the sky. Sarah smelled smoke before she saw flame. Keith was repairing a harness when the scent reached him. The leather fell from his hands. Sarah had seen him face rifles without losing control. She had seen him cross cliffs carrying 3 lives. She had never seen him become still in this particular way. His eyes fixed on the ridge, but for several seconds he seemed not to see it. The old fire had found him. Sam ran from the yard. Keith, Sarah caught the boy before he reached him. Get Eli. Take both water buckets to the cave now. Sam heard the tone and obeyed. Sarah walked to Keith. Smoke thickened above the ridge. Look at me. He did not. Sarah took his wrist. Years earlier he had done the same when Eli's fever pulled her back into the terror of the salt. Keith now, not then. His gaze shifted. Sarah pointed to the house. The boys are here. I am here. You are here. What do we do? The question reached him. His chest expanded. He looked at the wind, then the smoke. He wet one finger and lifted it. West wind. Fire north of them. He moved. Within minutes, the whole household had work. The boys carried water into the cave. Sarah soaked blankets. Keith widened the fire break around the roof and corral. They released the goats into the lower wash in case the pen caught. Sarah packed food, clothes, the deerskin bundle with the blue ribbon, and the tin of family papers into the old tattered shawl. She noticed what she had done only after tying the knot. The shawl had become a rescue bundle again, not a relic, a tool. The fire never entered the canyon. Wind shifted after midnight and drove it along the outer slope. From the highest ledge they watched orange light pulse beyond the rock while ash fell in small gray flakes. The boys slept near dawn. Sarah found Keith sitting outside the cave. He held the packet of hair and blue ribbon in both hands. For years she had not asked for the complete story. That night he gave pieces of it without being asked. His wife had been named Lila. Their daughter was 4. A retaliatory patrol had burned several shelters after horses disappeared from an army post. Keith had been away with 2 other men. By the time he returned, the fire had taken the roof and most of the wall. He pulled Lila out alive. She died before morning. He never found enough of his daughter to bury. The words came slowly, some in English, some in gestures Sarah had learned to understand. He did not embellish them. He did not turn his grief into accusation against every soldier or every white person he later met. That restraint hurt Sarah almost more. And when you found us, she said, you carried the boys because of her. Keith looked at the ribbon. Because alive, he said. Sarah closed her eyes. Because alive, not because they were hers, not because they were white, not because saving them repaired his daughter. Life itself had been enough reason. Sarah sat beside him until the eastern sky turned gray. In the morning, Sam found them there. He saw the ribbon in Keith's hand. Whose is that? Keith looked at Sarah. She let him choose. My girl, he said. Sam's face changed with the solemn speed of a child suddenly aware that adults existed before children knew them. Where is she? Keith pointed toward the sky, then toward his chest. Sam considered this. Then he climbed into Keith's lap without asking permission. Keith closed one arm around him. Sarah turned away to give them a privacy neither had requested. The fire left black scars on the distant ridge. The next winter, green shoots appeared through the burned ground. Keith took the boys to see them. Fire bad? Eli asked. Keith looked at the new grass. Fire is fire, he said. Sarah understood the answer. The thing itself was real. What men did with it, what it destroyed, what grew afterward, those were separate truths. That same year, Sarah began writing a record for the boys. Not a grand history. She used whatever paper Jed could spare and kept the sheets wrapped in oilcloth. She wrote dates when she knew them. Weather when she did not, births of goat kids, harvest amounts, injuries, visitors, and the names of the dead. Thomas Miller, Martha Higgins, Lila, Keith's daughter, whose name Sarah learned, but wrote only after asking permission. She wrote about the salt crossing without turning Keith into a legend. She described where he slipped, where he bled, how he used his teeth when his fingers could not untie the shawl. She wrote that courage was not the absence of weakness because she had seen his legs shake. She wrote about Silas, too, not as a monster. That seemed too easy. She wrote that he had convinced himself control was care, and that this made him dangerous because he could perform cruelty while believing he was righteous. When Sam asked why she bothered writing what everyone in the house already knew, Sarah set down the pencil. Because one day someone who wasn't here may tell you what happened. Sam frowned. They'd be wrong. They might be. They might also sound very certain. Eli, who was shaping clay animals beside the hearth, looked up. Like Marshall Vance? Sarah smiled sadly. Exactly like Marshall Vance. Keith listened from the doorway. That evening he brought Sarah a thin board polished smooth on both sides. He had cut it to fit beneath her papers so she could write on her lap. Sarah ran her fingers over the wood. You approve of my book? Keith nodded. Even the part where I wrote that you stole 2 horses? He frowned. Sarah laughed. History must be honest. Keith held up 2 fingers. I wrote 2, he pointed at her, and I wrote that you insist they were yours. Satisfied, he went back outside. The record grew slowly, so did the boys. By the time they were old enough to read Sarah's account for themselves, the salt crossing belonged to memory rather than fear. Yet Sarah kept the pages because memory, like water, needed a channel if it was going to reach the next season without disappearing into the ground. At 10, Samuel and Elias could move through the canyon almost as quietly as Keith. Almost. Sarah still heard them when Keith did not want to admit he did. They spoke English with her, learned Keith's signs, and the fragments of his first language he chose to teach them, and understood that belonging did not require pretending their 2 worlds had never hurt each other. Sarah told them about Thomas. She refused to turn their dead father into either saint or fool. He loved you, she said. He wanted more for us than he knew how to build. Sam, always direct, asked, would he like Keith? Sarah looked across the fire at Keith. Keith looked suddenly interested in sharpening a knife. At first, no, Sarah said. Eli grinned. Later, Sarah considered. If your father had lived long enough to become wiser, I hope so. Keith looked up. Sarah met his eyes. The answer was enough. The first time Keith allowed the boys to hunt beyond the lower ridge without him, Sarah discovered that motherhood did not become easier when children grew strong. It only found new ways to frighten her. Samuel and Elias left before sunrise with bows, water, dried corn cakes, and strict instructions to return before the light left the western wall. They had traveled those ridges many times with Keith. They knew where not to step, where rattlesnakes warmed themselves, how quickly a dry wash could become dangerous after distant rain. Sarah knew all of this. By noon, she had checked the sky 6 times. Keith repaired a saddle strap beneath the overhang. They should have crossed the north saddle by now. He kept working. An hour later, Sarah said, a cloud is building east of the basin. Keith glanced once at the cloud and returned to the leather. It is not raining here, Sarah said, answering the objection he had not made. At mid-afternoon, she stood at the canyon mouth. Keith joined her. You are worried too. He shook his head. Liar. He looked toward the ridge. Sarah crossed her arms. When they were babies, I thought if I could keep them alive one more day, I would never ask anything else of God. That was foolish. Now I want them alive tomorrow, and next year, and when they are old men. Keith understood enough to smile. Greedy, he said. Sarah turned to him in outrage. You have learned exactly the wrong English words. The joke eased nothing. When sunset began staining the high rock, Sarah reached for her boots. Keith caught her hand. Wait. It was the same command he had given through gestures years ago when rationing water at the seep. Sarah almost argued. Then a whistle came from above. 2 short notes. Keith answered. A moment later, Sam appeared on the upper trail, dusty and grinning. Eli followed with a rabbit hanging from his belt and a torn sleeve. Sarah's relief became anger so quickly that both boys stopped smiling. You're late. Sam looked at the sun. Not dark yet. Do not negotiate with the light. Eli held up the rabbit as if it might defend them. Keith inspected the torn sleeve. Catclaw, Eli explained. Keith nodded. No injury. No danger. Lesson learned. Sarah wanted to gather both boys against her chest the way she had on the salt flats. Instead, she made herself look at what stood in front of her. 2 capable children returning under their own power. She touched Sam's cheek, then Eli's. Next time earlier. Yes, Mama. They meant it for at least that evening. At supper, the boys told the story of the hunt in competing versions. Keith corrected their tracking mistakes with gestures. Sarah mended Eli's sleeve. The rabbit simmered with onions and beans. Watching them, Sarah understood another thing Keith had taught her, without saying it. Protection could become another form of possession if fear never allowed the protected to leave. He had carried her when she could not stand. Then he had pointed to the branch. He had carried the boys when they could not breathe. Now he let them cross the ridge without him. Love, if it was worthy of the name, had to know the difference. One autumn evening, almost 11 years after the salt flats, the boys returned from a hunt carrying a young buck between them on a pole. Sarah heard them before she saw them. They argued in whispers about whose shot had turned the animal first. Your arrow missed the heart. It turned because of my arrow. It turned because it was running away from your bad shooting. Sarah smiled from the edge of the garden. If the deer could hear you, it would die of embarrassment a second time. The boys emerged from the lower path, taller than Sarah remembered allowing them to become. Samuel had her eyes. Elias had Thomas's mouth when he smiled. Both carried themselves with the balanced ease Keat had taught them. Keat stood near the corral repairing a gate hinge. He had aged visibly at last. Gray threaded his black hair. The old damage in his left leg showed more on cold mornings. His hands remained strong. Sam dropped his end of the pole. Keat, tell him the shot turned it. Keat examined the wound. Eli waited smugly. Keat pointed to the mark on the ground where the buck had stumbled, then to Sam's arrow, then made a small turning gesture. Sam crowed in triumph. Eli protested. Sarah shook her head. You two have spent your entire lives learning silence, and still refuse to use it when it would benefit the household. The boys carried the deer to the cleaning rack. Above the roofline, a long strip of gray-white wool snapped in the evening wind. The tattered shawl had become too fragile to wear years earlier. Sarah had almost folded it into a chest. Keat had tied it above the house instead. Sun had bleached it nearly white. The original torn section still showed where he had made the harness that saved the twins. Sarah sometimes worried wind would finally take it. Keat said if it did, it had already done enough work. She was not sure, she agreed. Some objects became witnesses. The irrigation channels carried water past squash, beans, corn, onions, and the stubborn peach tree. Mint still grew thickest near the original seep. The cave where Sarah first woke remained cool even in summer, used now for storage and as a refuge during the hottest afternoons. Jed's first coffee tin sat on a shelf, dented and rusted. Thomas's compass was gone, resting on his grave beneath the salt wind. Keat's daughter's blue ribbon remained wrapped in deerskin inside the same pocket Sarah had once repaired. Nothing had been erased. That was important. Home had not been made by pretending the past did not exist. It had been made by giving the past somewhere to sit without letting it command the table. Sarah walked to the corral. Keat was tightening the gate pin. She leaned against the cedar post. The boys think they are men now. Keat looked toward them. Sam and Eli were still arguing over the deer. No, he said. Sarah smiled. Your longest speech all day. He nudged her shoulder with his. The contact was ordinary. That was what made it precious. Years earlier, any touch between them had carried warning, rescue, instruction, or uncertainty. Now her shoulder knew the shape of his without thought. They had never stood before a preacher. No judge had entered the canyon to name what they were. The world outside might have lacked a box for them. Inside the canyon, there was no confusion. Keat had raised her sons. Sarah had tended his wounds and shared his winters. They had built walls together, planted food, buried animals, survived fever, argued over coffee, taught children, and sat through grief. Marriage, Sarah had learned, could be a paper promise or a daily fact. She did not need to decide which word other people preferred. Eli called from the cleaning rack. Mama, Sam cut the hide wrong. I did not. Sarah closed her eyes. There goes my peaceful evening. Keat held out his knife. You go, Cord. He smiled openly now. Something that would have stunned the woman who first saw him on the salt. Sarah took the knife and walked toward the boys. Halfway there, she stopped. The western sky burned orange above the white basin far below. From the canyon rim, the salt flats looked like a distant inland sea. She could see the place where the world had almost ended for her. Not the exact spot. Distance had softened it into brightness. Sarah touched the scar in her palm. Once she had believed survival meant getting back to the life she had lost. She knew better now. Survival had not returned anything. It had demanded that she build something new with whatever remained. A torn shawl, a hidden spring, 2 hungry children, a man with burned skin and very few words. Her own hands. Behind her, Keat finished with the gate and came to stand beside her. The boys' voices carried across the yard. A goat complained from its pen. The fire popped beneath the cooking pot. Mint and wood smoke mixed in the cooling air. Sarah leaned her shoulder against Keat's. He did not ask what she was thinking. She did not tell him. Some truths had become too well lived to need explanation. Above them, the shawl pulled hard against its ties. Worn threads glowing pale in the sunset. The same cloth had once been the last useless remnant of Sarah's old life. Keat had torn it because 3 people needed something stronger than memory. He had made it into a harness. Years later, it moved in the wind over a home neither of them had been promised. Sam shouted, "Mama!" Sarah called back, "I'm coming." Keith glanced toward the house. "Together?" he asked. The word carried no ceremony now. It was almost teasing. Sarah looked at him, at the lines time had cut around his eyes, at the scar beneath his jaw, at the man who had once crossed 40 miles of burning ground with her entire life strapped to his body. "Together," she said. They walked back toward the fire.